Thanks, Manfredo. It's really good, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak along, Hendrik, to speak today. What I'm going to do is I'll just go through something which is a bit down of a knockdown version of something that I gave to a presentation to the local members of the urban design and urban community and urban planning community here in New Zealand. And yeah, we did have the bear hunt, Lee. Yes, we had the bear hunt. My kids were doing that all through through Auckland, so that was very good. What I'd like to talk about is that COVID-19 has had quite a huge impact, obviously, across the world. And New Zealand, I think, and maybe a little bit better than Australia, and no disrespect to my Australian colleagues, that life in New Zealand has pretty much returned to normal in a normal sense. Today, I was actually in the South Island of New Zealand. I was in Queenstown, where it's very cold. It's actually cold here in Auckland, and I could just travel freely. There was no restrictions on the plane, and I just flew straight back from the south of New Zealand back to the north, where I'd been working down in the South Island, and things are slowly returning to normal. But I'd like to talk about some of the things that we could do and some of the opportunities and some of the barriers that we've had and what's come out of this COVID-19 for me and a lot of other people, is to talk about what we could do in these professions to try and improve the quality of our outcomes, public health, public spaces, and the public realm and growth management in all together. And I think that we do a lot of talk in New Zealand about these types of things, but unfortunately we don't seem to do very much of this in some ways. I mean, things are getting better, but I think this is what I'm trying to say, is this is a really good opportunity for us to do this and return to the concepts of local neighbourhood creation, the idea of actually creating livable and walkable communities with active travel options and not needing the whole idea of commuting and such like. It's not a new concept. This is a map of my hometown, and these are some old planning maps, which I won't bore you with, but they go right back to 1974 when we really started to work on growth management. And if you could look at these maps in detail, and I won't bore you with it, but you could see that over the preceding sort of 30, 40 years, we've put out all these ideas of growth management. We've talked about all these types of things of trying to consolidate around centres, around transit types of things, the Todd-orientated development. But we just constantly don't really do it that well. We just keep expanding out of the periphery and such like. And it's really interesting when you look at these, that how much land has actually gone into that space. And so I'd argue that, we've talked about this a lot. And I'm going to talk about the hometown that Kim and Manfredo and myself live in. And Auckland is my hometown. I was born and bred here. But a lot of what I'm talking about now would apply in other parts of New Zealand. As I said, I was in the south of the country today working on some of these exact issues. What I'd like to see is think that this could provide us with a fundamental opportunity for change. I think the worst thing that could happen to us in New Zealand, and I think this goes globally, is that we just go back to the return to the business as usual. And I'll talk about that quickly at the end, because there's a lot of pressure in New Zealand and all around the world. You can see that in the US, you can see that in Europe, you can see it wherever you like, to try and get the economy moving and all those types of things. And I think in many ways what happened in New Zealand, we had a loss of liberty for 6 weeks. It was quite an intense thing where we weren't allowed to go out apart from the supermarket. That was it. And we could walk around the streets, but only in our local environment. We couldn't go anywhere else. And I think that has paid off. It has given us a scenario where, as I say, where it's pretty much almost coming back to life as normal. But I think that as professional groups, as urban designers and urban planners and architects and landscape architects, we've got to show leadership in this space. This is my high street. This is not far from where I live. In fact, it's 5 minutes walk. And this is the day just before lockdown ended, and there's basically no cars in there. And if I showed you today, it'd just be full of cars and people, but then there was just nothing. It was incredible. You could walk on our streets, you could just take them over, and you go to the local park, and I'd never seen our park so busy with people in them. And let's say people didn't worry about traffic. They just walked over the streets, they rode their bikes and just did their thing. And we'd reclaim the streets. It was actually a really, really cool experience. But I think the thing that I think this has brought home to a lot of us is how unresilient many parts of our urban systems were. It highlighted the underlying problems that we've had in our society, in New Zealand society. And I'm just not us, I'm sure it's, as I say, a lot of the things I'm talking about I'm sure could resonate with you in your own spaces in the US, America, wherever, Asia, wherever. The issues of housing affordability, homelessness, equity, access to technology. It was very interesting as a university when everything went remote. We all went onto Zoom, and I never want to do that again. I never want to teach a studio on Zoom, but we all went that way. But it raised this whole digital divide and who has access to technology and who has access to high-speed broadband to actually run all these sorts of things. So it was really interesting. The cost of social dislocation really came out. And I say that loss of liberty just reinforced the dislocation of people and things like that. I thought was really, really, really interesting. Issues of food security, all those types of things, brought to the fore why are we allowing people to build housing on high productive soils, you know, and we talk about food miles and all those types of things. All these sort of discussions came to the fore and just showed how unresilient our system really, really was. And this is the thing that we were talking about, is that a lot of the urban planning documents, when I'm afraid I was talking about growth management and looking at those things, and I showed you those plans originally about how we've talked about this type of stuff. But apart from a few examples, and things have changed over the last sort of 15 years, I think things are getting much better. There's a lot more intensification, a lot more thinking about quality of design, a lot more of those types of things have taken place in Auckland and throughout the other parts of New Zealand. But we've really talked about these concepts of livability, but we really haven't really delivered it that much. And still the evidence is there. We're still developing car-based cities. And what I think for us is a really opportunity is to take this thing and say, let's do what we've talked about and create resilient, sustainable communities where people don't have to commute long lengths of terms. We don't have to rely on things for the things we've just talked about. I mean, you know, and for me, urban design, urban planning, you know, all the built form professionals are about normative behavior. And if you design, especially in what we've been doing, is designing for cars, well, that's what you get. It's, you know, it's normative behavior. So if we've got to start changing our behavior and then actually starting coming up with the visions and then start delivering on those and actually delivering meaningful outcomes that will actually bring us back to the space that we saw through that COVID lockdown period over 6 weeks, where we really couldn't go anywhere apart from walk. And I mean, our local neighborhood, we really couldn't go outside our suburb. That's what we were limited to. If you went any further than that, and the police stopped you, you're in all sorts of trouble. So, but it just, as I brought back that we could, if we could think about living like that, and what we've been talking about would be really, really cool. Some of the problems that we have, though, is that we still have this underlying desire for single detached housing, and that typology change is changing. But I think we really haven't talked about the values and trade-offs that you get with quality open space, you know, and quality resilient communities, quality types of things. We really haven't talked about that in a meaningful way to bring those sort of things forward for us to think on. And we haven't fully explained those trade-offs. So that people, the average, you know, I hate using that word average, but the average person go, oh, I know what you really talk about. There's also, I think, a lot of other issues to think about when you do talk about the cost of land values, the cost of construction. And unfortunately, in New Zealand, it's just incredibly high. It costs 30% more to build a house in Auckland than it does in Sydney. And that's just to do with economies of scale and some people making, you know, there's a lot of people making a lot of money out of the system here. And not so there's a lot of other underlying tensions that go on with that. So, but, you know, and we also have to be concerned about the whole issue about if you do start talking about housing affordability, the last thing you want to do is then distort your whole housing market and a whole lot of people going into negative gearing. And I think that's the other thing that's come out of COVID is how unresilient some people were. I mean, we had some businesses that shut down for 6 weeks and will never come back. And it just shows you how unresilient in many ways and how reliant they were on certain things. So we do have to be careful about those types of things. I think there's a really interesting thing that you're starting to see in New Zealand now is that we're moving away from a more neoliberal type of system. We never really had that in many ways. It was a very socialistic version of neoliberalism in New Zealand. It wasn't the classical sense, but we're moving away from that more to the role of the state. And you can see a much more stronger role in the state in intervening in housing supply, infrastructure supply. In one way is to try and get the economy going again and keep it, you know, it's really interesting today. The data is coming out that unemployment's not going to be as high as I thought it was going to be. Economic GDP is not going to go back down as much as again because the economy is starting to go. But again, the state is starting to intervene more into housing supply, especially in dealing with those more vulnerable people, which I think is one of the positive things that can come out of that. And they say, but part of the problem with that is, again, like the housing issue, housing construction industry in New Zealand is not big. It doesn't have the economies of scale that you get in the US, the Europe, and obviously Asia, and you would get in Australia. So it's a really interesting thing for us to think about. But I think there's a really interesting opportunity for us as a professional groupings and for the university space as academics is try and capture this narrative and talk about what this is giving us the opportunity to revisit these things and actually deliver on these things that we've talked about for so long and actually think about developing these resilient communities. But what worries me, as I say, is we can go straight back to the status quo and we just think about economic growth over all the things that we really should be thinking about. And that does worry me that we're starting to do that. And you can see that with some legislation. The New Zealand government, in New Zealand, we just have one government. We don't have states or anything like that. We just have one central government. And it's introducing new fast-tracking legislation to fast-track planning projects that they deem to be important to just get the things going. So it's a really interesting concept. But I think what I'm trying to say here is there's a really big opportunity that we can capture from what we had from the space that we're in to try and value these types of things, capture that narrative, and try and encourage people to move forward to develop these types of things and deliver on these promises that we've always wanted to do. So I think there's a really strong role for us in the university sector and in the professional sectors to stand up and show leadership in this space and stop the narrative being captured by the usual things about economic growth. And I think that will be my 7 minutes. So that's what I wanted to say. Thanks very much. It is a cold day here in Auckland. It's a cold night. It's about coming up to 10 o'clock at night. But thank you very much for the opportunity to speak tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.